Welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, the community coordinator with the Stewardship Network, and we are so happy to have you here today. So first, I would like to talk a little bit about us at the Stewardship Network. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based TSN member communities across the Great Lakes with emerging presences across the country. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of these different aspects of our mission now. So we connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for TSN member communities, and we share it as widely as possible. We equip, we remove hurdles for TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And we mobilize. Through our TSN member communities, we make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. So now I would like to share a little bit deeper dive into some aspects of those different pillars of our mission. So Connect, one of our favorite examples of Connect is coming right up. The Stewardship Network's annual conference happening January 23rd and 24th of this year, 23rd, 24th, 2025. Easy to remember. We'll be at the Kellogg Center in East Lansing, Michigan. And I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what you can expect at the conference. And I will also remind you that you can find more information at stewardshipnetwork.org/conference. So once again, January 23rd and 24th, 2025, and it is in person. We're so excited to have everyone back again this year for an in-person conference. Once again at the Kellogg Center in East Lansing, Michigan. And the goal is to learn, connect, and replenish. And that means a great deal to us as we are all doing this work that is so important, and we can feel so isolated sometimes, and we can run into barriers and kind of just hiccups in the road where we need to experience new perspectives or just renew our inspiration to continue this work. And so learning, connecting, and replenishing ourselves during the conference is a major priority for us, and we hope that you will join us to do just that. Speaking of which, we have a wonderful video that Bob will drop in the chat for us that compiles some of our TSN conference testimonials from over the years, some incredible partners of the network, and also some speakers at past conferences have shared some of their testimonies. So we hope that you will check that out after the webcast, of course, but Bob will post that in the chat now. So feel free to check that out. But now we'll go into a little bit more information. So you got to be there. It's going to be amazing. We've already got a ton of registrations. It's going to be a really incredible turnout, and we have an amazing lineup of speakers for you as well. So the full agenda is now online, including information on which of our sessions are qualifying for MDARD recertification credits. And if you don't know what that is, no big deal. If you know what that is, you know that it's a great opportunity to get some continuing education credits. So check out the agenda to see which sessions qualify for that. We have over 80 excellent speakers, from seasoned leaders to emerging voices in the field. We do our best to try to get a wide range of perspectives, both geographically and also different levels of experience, so that we can give people an opportunity to have their voices be heard. And advanced registration discounts end this weekend on January 12th. So we encourage you to take advantage of the discounts that are currently available. And after that date, we will be offering only our full-priced registration. So register on or before the 12th to take advantage of that opportunity. Now, in terms of Equip, another one of our favorite programs that we do at the Stewardship Network is Gloves for Good. Our Gloves for Good program has now delivered more than 37,000 pairs of lightly used work gloves to nature's caretakers, saving recipient organizations over $56,000. That is absolutely incredible. Thank you to our partners in that program, and thank you to all of the folks that have ordered gloves from us. Right now, we have roughly 1,500 pairs of gloves that are on their way to the Connecticut River Conservancy for their annual Source to Sea cleanup and other great stewardship initiatives that they are running. So that is a wonderful group to be sending these gloves to. Now, does your team need gloves for 2025 events and activities? Order early in the year to get ahead of the rush and supply constraints, because we never know how many we're exactly going to have. And we're happy to bring any custom orders to the TSN conference this year. So if you would like to take advantage of that, when you are requesting your gloves, you can put, or you select the option free. I am attending the TSN conference 2025 and I will pick them up at the event. We will pack them and we will bring them right to you. So please do that as soon as possible so we can be prepared at the conference, but we encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. And finally, mobilize. In total, our 20 plus vibrant and diverse TSN member communities engage with over 600 partner groups across roughly 213,000 square miles of local ecosystem service area. Such a big number that I couldn't even say it. But we encourage you to check out more of our 2024 stats at stewardshipnetwork.org/impact, and you can learn more about the wonderful things we've done in 2024. And we are so excited to kick off 2025. And with that, our first webcast of 2025. So I am very happy to introduce John Vucetich, professor at Michigan Technological University, and Rolf Peterson, professor emeritus at Michigan Technological University, with their webcast today, What the Wolves of Isle Royale Teach Us About Our Relationship with Nature. With that, I will have you all take over the screen share. That's great. I'm seeing it. And now you're in full presenter view. Great. I will mute and you can take it away.
Very good. I'm Rolf Peterson, and I'll start things off. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the TSN crowd, and thank you, Rob, for such a generous introduction. I learned a lot. We'll be talking, both John and I, about the wolves and moose of Isle Royale, which is the northernmost piece of Michigan. It's really a piece of the boreal forest to the north to a certain extent. John and I have both been involved for decades, and I should not fail to mention the support that we've had from the National Science Foundation, which is the primary organization that's provided funds for this research work. Michigan Tech, of course, is our home institution. It's been very supportive for almost 50 years. And finally, the National Park Service, which helps support a collaborative program between Michigan Tech and the National Park Service in this Isle Royale National Park. There's more information, of course, on the internet. IsleRoyaleWolf.org gets you a ton of information. We have a Facebook page, so a lot of information for those that are interested. If you need any geographic orientation, of course, Isle Royale is the largest island in the largest freshwater lake in the world. It's wonderfully isolated, but just about the right distance from the mainland to provide isolation, but not complete isolation. And isolation is a major theme that will run through our talk. It's both good and bad. Isle Royale itself is a huge chunk of land, 210 square miles, 540 square kilometers, almost 20 miles away from the mainland. Not so far, though, that the major players of the boreal forest have failed to get there. Wolves, moose, beaver, foxes, snowshoe hares are some of the major players that affect the ecosystem in many diverse ways. So it's a simple system. We're lacking some 30 species that are found on the mainland. So it's a wolf moose system, basically, with some inputs from beaver as well. Once the animals get to Isle Royale and establish a population, of course, they're stuck there. They're isolated there. There's not a lot of movement back and forth from the mainland, and that makes our job of counting them, which is critical. Counting them every year for the last 66 years, that makes our job of counting them easier because we're not worried about those immigration and emigration problems. And then finally, the island is secure from all kinds of nasty effects of humans, primarily it's harvest by people, legal and illegal, that affects wolves and moose and trees almost everywhere else in the world. So it's this is one of the major benefits of isolation, is just simple protection. And of course, as a national park, it has legal protection as well. The the work in the field is separated into winter work and summer work. Very briefly, the animals are counted, wolves and moose are counted in the winter by aircraft, small aircraft based on the island. And that has provided with a 66-year history of wolf and moose fluctuations, which we'll get into very shortly. In the summertime, we also have people in the field, citizen scientists basically, that scour the island. And keep in mind, there are no roads, just walking trails, and we don't even use the walking trails because the moose that we're interested in have lived and died off trail for the most part. But these are volunteers who collect information on the demography of moose, a very valuable contribution. We watch the wolves to a great extent while we're counting them, and we observe wolves that are behaving normally without any major effects of human persecution, which again, I emphasize is almost unique in the world today. We are able to observe this wolf-moose interaction directly, and that's provided a wealth of information about what kind of moose wolves are able to kill. And the basic story hasn't changed much. Wolves are able to kill only the easy moose in the population, the very young, the very old, that have various kinds of bony pathology. This is a shot of arthritis in a hip joint in the lower portion of the image, tooth problems in the upper right. The moose in the background was a 15-year-old cow moose that was chased down and killed within 2 minutes, and she had arthritis on one side, which rendered her very easy for wolves to figure out.
Okay, and now we'll switch over to some thoughts that I'll share with you. As Rolf alluded to, one of the centerpieces of the work that we've done is to have created a time series, a graph that shows the fluctuations of abundance of wolves and moose over the past 66 years. And I'm going to share with you those dynamics, but I'm going to do it by showing just little bits at a time, in part because that's the way the information was revealed to the world at the first time. So on this particular graph, along the bottom, it shows time going back to 1959 all the way up to the present. Wolves on this graph are marked in the blue line, and they're also indicated over on the left from 0 to 50. You can see there's a few years there that I'm just showing you now where there's between 20, 25 wolves. And then moose are over on the right-hand side, 0 to 2,500 moose, and they're indicated by the brown line, that line that's just a little over 500. Now, I'm showing the first 5 years of data for a few reasons. One is to appreciate that most studies in ecology don't last even for 5 years. And after watching something for a few years, ecologists are in the habit of interpreting what it is that they've seen. And the people who started this project, a person named Durwood Allen and Dave Meach, when they collected this data, and after they saw it, they interpreted it. And they wrote this in the early 1960s. They said that our studies thus far indicate that the wolf and moose populations on Isle Royale have struck a reasonably good balance, kind of indicating the fact that the fluctuations weren't very great. They didn't change in abundance by very much. One of the real great insights that Durwood Allen had is also something very simple, which is that, all right, that's fine. Not much has happened. But if something different were to happen next, there will only be one way to know, and that's to keep watching. And so he did. And now we're going to jump all the way to 14 years into the study, another 10 years past what I showed you the first time. Here, the wolves in the blue, they've kind of gone up and down a little bit. Hard to make too much of a pattern out of that, but the moose population has more than doubled in the time that that I'm showing you here up until now. So if there was a balance of nature before, one has to at least admit there's been a significant shift in that balance of nature. And I should also at this point kind of indicate what some of the motivation was for watching these abundances and how they may or may not change over time, which is that back in the 1960s and even in the early 70s, it was unclear how a predator population and a prey population might coexist, or even whether they could. At that time, there was theory, ecological theory, that would suggest that, yeah, maybe they could coexist, but maybe one would drive the other to extinction, or maybe they'd both go extinct. There were laboratory experiments, mostly with like zooplankton, stuff you could put on a shelf in a lab, that would give different impressions about what might happen. But out in the real world, so to speak, no one knew. And so these were the first glimpses of trying to understand whether a predator and prey population could coexist. And then what happened next is that there were a series of winters in the early 1970s, and they were winters that gave a little bit of favor to the wolves, a little bit of disfavor to the moose. And what happened now is that the moose population, again, they're in brown, they have more than doubled and then fallen to half their maximum size. And the wolf population, as you can see, has really just gone through the ceiling. There were 50 wolves in 1980. And there have always been critics of folks who like to watch nature for a long, long time. And the critics in our case have been, well, geez, aren't you ever going to be finished watching? And haven't you kind of answered all the questions? After 22 years of watching, a lot of those critics have kind of quieted down, because now there's a lot of questions that seem obvious even to non-experts about like what's going to happen next. Is it possible for wolves to stay so high in abundance? Is it possible that wolves would drive moose to extinction? Nobody really knew. And so now it's becoming obvious to more folks that, yeah, there's only one way to find out what happened next. That's keep watching. What happened next, elements of it were expected. There were a lot of wolves that died from the usual kinds of causes, starvation and wolves killing one another. But the rates of mortality were really fantastic. And in just 2 years' time, the wolf population fell from its all-time high of 50 to what at the time was its all-time low of 14. And when you go from 50 to 14 in just 2 years, the question is obvious. Is it possible that those wolves could go extinct? And in any case, whether they go extinct or not, what's going to happen with the moose population? It would seem like they've been freed up now. They can probably start to increase once again, or so people wondered. And again, questions, but in just a 2-year span, the questions have completely reversed themselves about what's the interesting question here and what's liable to happen next. And well, now we're all the way up to 38 years of watching. What happens next, if we trace that blue line for the wolves, they make the short-lived recovery, partial recovery, and then they bottom out to even lower numbers. They spend the better part of a decade in the low teens. And all the while that that's occurring, the moose population has just gone through the ceiling, higher in a way than anyone could have imagined. And as the moose population has increased so greatly, now it becomes really very apparent the kind of impact that moose can have on the forest. And one of the trees that moose are most connected with, especially in the wintertime, is a tree called balsam fir. And that's what we're looking at in both of these images here. Top image where a moose has taken a clip of a balsam fir twig, and then the bottom image shows how much impact moose can have on a balsam fir from just year after year of browsing. And one of the things that we found during this period of time, reported in the mid-1990s, is that while the wolf population was held low, and they were held low, by the way, because of a disease that had struck them, a disease, canine parvovirus, that humans had inadvertently brought to Isle Royale. So they're held low, and then the moose population increases. And observations that were able to be made at the time showed that balsam fir growth, this really important forest species, really exhibited significant decline. And this turns out to be, again, in the mid-1990s, the first time that a trophic cascade had ever been documented in a terrestrial system. It had been documented in marine systems and aquatic systems before, but never in a terrestrial system. And actually, scientists were wondering in the 90s, maybe they don't even happen on land. Now, of course, we know they happen often on land. This was the first demonstration of it. And again, this idea of trophic cascade, what it means is that there's the predator that's at the top trophic level, and their effects can cascade all the way through the other trophic levels, all the way down to the vegetation. Again, first time ever documented in a terrestrial system on Isle Royale National Park. And then the other thing we were wondering at this time is, well, why are the wolves so low, and why are they seeming to remain so low for so long? moose population has been increasing. That would seem to be like potential food supply for the wolves. And it's in the mid 90s that we began to wonder kind of seriously whether inbreeding and the adverse effects of inbreeding are maybe what's causing wolves to stay so low. They're isolated on an island. There are never very many of them at any given time, on average a couple of dozen. So we know that they'd be vulnerable to inbreeding. What's less known is, are the adverse effects of inbreeding going to be a problem for them or not? And I have to say, back in the 90s, I don't think we ever thought we'd have the answer to that question. Just inbreeding at that time was the sort of thing that could only be studied in laboratories or with captive animals and experimental settings and that sort of thing. And so it was just left as a wondering for us at the time. And then what happened next is absolutely could not have been predicted. This is the winter of 1996. In our part of the world, it's the most severe winter on record. So at least the most severe winter in about 100 years' time or so. Winter arrived early. The snows were very, very deep, and winter didn't leave until quite late. And this really severe winter coincided with a shortage of food for the moose population because they had been so abundant for so long. They had been depleting their food supply. So you had this combination of severe winter, food shortage. The moose had basically left the forest in sticks. That's all that they left to eat. And in just 1 year's time, the population had this really remarkable decline from about 2,500 moose to about 700 moose. Now, these two declines that we've seen, the one for the wolves back in the 80s, and the one for the moose here that we're talking about now, they have one similarity. They're both dramatic in the sense that they're in the neighborhood of about 75 or 80% declines, but they differ in a different way. If you go from 50 to 14 wolves in 2 years' time, your real concern there is that they could just go extinct. In 1996, there's still about 700 moose. And they're not going to go extinct. That's not a concern. But it's really just how much death there was. In 1995, there was one of the highest densities of moose that have ever been recorded. There were moose everywhere. And in the following year, it was one of the highest densities of moose carcasses. You couldn't walk down the trail, for which by about the time you stopped smelling the moose carcass behind you, you'd start smelling the one just up ahead. It really was kind of remarkable in a tragic sort of a way. And of course, just as the moose population is experiencing this collapse, it looks like the wolves are starting to have this kind of slight recovery once again. And that would seem to be poorly timed now because there just aren't that many moose anymore. And again, just an image here showing what a moose carcass looks like. And again, there were many, many, many hundreds of them across the island. What happened next, was confusing to us. The moose population, they're again in brown. They started to slowly increase, kind of as we expected after that severe winter, but then they bottomed out at even lower numbers. And the wolf population was really erratic, went up and down, but generally going up. And during that whole period of time that's marked in gray, really didn't have good explanations for what was happening or why. And so I'm going to leave it like that for us now. We didn't discover what was going on there until about 2010 or 11. And Rolf actually will tell us a little bit more about it in just a moment. So just kind of moving ahead, what happens next is the wolf population collapses all the way down to just 2 wolves. And some of the things that were happening along the way include that canine parvovirus showed up again. That's that disease that caused the wolf population to crash in the 80s. It kind of ran its course throughout the 90s, was just gone, but then reappeared in about 2009 and was tied to that little bit of decline there. This little bit of decline here is tied to, of all things, a couple of wolves fell into a mine pit. These mine pits are prehistoric on Isle Royale. They're just big holes in the ground, and they sometimes fill up with water, groundwater. And if an animal falls in them, they die and drown. And so a couple of wolves wouldn't seem like such a big deal, but these were important wolves. They were leaders of East Pack, and then it caused troubles for the entire pack, and that's tied to that little bit of decline. The other thing that's going on with this decline is that inbreeding, we know for sure now, is taking hold. All the while that wolves are declining, moose, again shown in brown, they're really starting to increase again like they had in the 1990s. And it's at this point that the National Park Service had to decide what they wanted to do. This is a picture of the last 3 wolves of this population on Isle Royale. The third wolf, the one on the left, is offspring of the 2 on the right. It died as a pup. It was so inbred, it really had no chance of surviving. And then the 2 wolves on the right, they had kind of proved that they were unable to reproduce, and if left to their own devices, they would have died, and that would have been the end. After much deliberation, the National Park Service decided to restore wolves to Isle Royale from what a biologist would say, from a demographic perspective, from a perspective of just paws on the ground and birth rates and death rates. It was a smashing success. The wolf population recovered really quite quickly. And shortly afterwards, the moose population started to decline once again. That decline at first was caused by shortage of food, but in the last few years, the continued decline has absolutely been driven by wolf predation. And so we will come back to this time series at the end of the presentation and say a little bit about like what it means. But before we do that, I'm going to turn things over to Rolf. He's going to tell you a little bit about those dynamics that I had indicated were perplexing to us for so long.
Yes, John's given a great overview of from a high level of the last 66 years, which is no small task. And I'll drill down on a couple of special topics, which provide some of the details behind those graphs. In 1997, it was a very cold winter. There was ice connecting Isle Royale with the mainland, and we weren't aware of it at the time. But a wolf walked over from the mainland, and he walked into a great situation. There were vacancies in 3 of the packs for a breeding wolf, and he walked into one of those and began reproducing. And in retrospect, well, we figured all this out in retrospect from DNA that we picked up in scats. This was a technique, fecal DNA, which we started using in 1999, which allowed us to track every wolf in the population from year to year, which was a wonderful innovation. It still seems like magic to me. And so the arrow on the left in our 2001 annual report, that is male 93. We called him the old gray guy. He didn't look old and gray at the time. He was just another wolf with the same old pelage as anybody else, and we didn't think anything was remarkable about him. As time went on, however, this wolf got whiter and whiter and whiter. So 5 years later, the same wolf is indicated by an arrow, and he's become quite a white wolf, which we'd never seen before. We didn't really know what to make of it. You can ascribe just about anything to inbreeding if you want to. And so we were just sort of wondering about this particular animal. Turns out he revolutionized the entire dynamics of the wolf population, and in some ways the entire island. And now those are the details I'll get into. The most surprising thing that we saw right away in the first decade of the 21st century was incredibly high kill rates by the wolf population. It was something we hadn't seen in the previous 50 years. Wolves were killing upwards of 20% of the moose population every year, which is just unbelievable predation pressure. So moose were reduced to the lowest level they had been for 100 years. And that was completely unexpected and amazing. John has already mentioned balsam fir and the sad state of trees that are hammered by moose every year. This is a photo taken in 1974 of a just absolutely wiped out patch of fir, which moose had been feeding on year after year after year. And this was sort of the standard that we had gotten used to at Isle Royale. But then in the early 21st century, when the old gray guy and his offspring started bearing down on the moose population, moose were reduced to the lowest level ever. And that same spot 38 years later was just this Christmas tree farm, just amazing recovery of fir trees. And these were individuals that had been just hanging on for 30, 40 years. All of a sudden, they're allowed to grow. Very, very remarkable. So this is the classic trophic cascade, which John alluded to. And it is very real. And it's somewhat easier to see at Isle Royale than in other places. The place where the trophic cascade idea has really captured the public imagination is, of course, Yellowstone. And the particular connection for most people is a YouTube video, which has been viewed 50 million times, entitled How Wolves Change Rivers. And I used to show it in classes as an example of a tremendous oversimplification and really a poorly supported idea that somehow wolves are going to change the Yellowstone River. I mean, that was the way it was assembled, very cleverly. Made you think, my gosh, wolves are completely overhauling Yellowstone National Park. And I don't disagree. I think they have actually overtaken the management of Yellowstone in terms of ecosystem services and ecosystem function. What I'm going to do now is to shift back to Isle Royale. You can go look at How Wolves Change Rivers if you like, but keep in mind that it's oversimplified and fundamentally wrong in many of its implications. But at Isle Royale, I'd like to talk about how wolves change lakes. And Isle Royale, of course, is a very simple system compared to Yellowstone, which is extremely complex. But we saw remarkable things at Isle Royale, which indicated, yes, wolves actually can change a water body. And while the notion of trophic cascade initially got going involving lakes and especially marine systems, the players were always in the water. But this is the case at Isle Royale where a terrestrial predator, an apex predator, the wolf, is actually affecting a water body. So I'll take you through that. I should mention that we sort of refer to moose as the boreal hippo. They're very tuned into aquatic resources. They feed underwater a lot. Their entire nose and face is probably an evolution towards aquatic feeding. None of the other members of the cervid family feed to such a high extent on aquatics, and none of them have that very long bulbous nose that a moose has. So this clip shows you, yeah, moose do feed underwater a lot. I should mention that we generally are in the dark about what moose are doing down there, because it's hard to see underwater. And 20 years ago, we got a little bit of insight into this when we had a remotely controlled underwater rover, and we put it in front of a moose who was feeding in the water. This is a lot easier said than done, but we were very lucky. And here it is, a moose feeding on the bottom. They appear to be completely non-selected. They'll eat anything on the bottom. It would so appear. I should point out that these aquatic plants are very, very high in protein. So this is a wonderful source of forage. I can also point out the moose's eyes are open and it's not blowing bubbles. And that's a reflection of its adaptation for feeding underwater. It can close its nose by just thinking about it. You can't do that. You'd have to hold your nose with your fingers. A moose can shut off its nose. And of course, the danger for a moose is always above water. So that's why it's patrolling the above water scene and not particularly concerned about a little yellow submarine under the water, which we were filming it with. And we just let it run, hoping the moose would not destroy this little device sitting watching it. But anyway, this is just a fun video to show you how important aquatic plants are to moose. People have been trying to duplicate this footage for the last 20 years, and so far they haven't succeeded yet. So we were very lucky. and the moose was good to us. By the late 2000s, first decade of the 21st century, and you recall the old gray guy and his offspring had pushed moose down to an extremely low level, very high predation rates are the context for this. And then all of a sudden, rather dramatically, several lakes became overtaken by an aquatic plant. I literally didn't know what it was, but another graduate student was working on aquatic feeding by beaver and moose, and she told me, "Yeah, this is water shield, a native floating leaf aquatic plant. Again, very high in protein, maybe 20-30% protein on a dry matter basis." So what we were looking at was, in retrospect, an aquatic trophic cascade prompted by one wolf. This the old gray guy who came in and just totally overhauled the genetics and demography of the wolf population, pushing moose down to a level where finally this aquatic plant could blossom. It's always been there. In fact, it's been there for 8,000 years. It has a distinctive pollen signature, and the plant is, yeah, it's been there forever. So this is great evidence, strictly observational, of an aquatic trophic cascade. And moose, of course, took advantage of this aquatic plant. However, this is about the time when the genetic collapse of the wolf population became quite clear. Wolves are declining dramatically over the early years, 2010 to 2015. And this just turned moose loose once again. Moose were increasing 20% every year. And so they just took over the island. And as much as they like to eat water shield, they just simply ate it all. And beaver contributed to that too, but moose eat 10 times more than beaver. So this was a moose destruction, because the trophic cascade phenomenon was taken apart, dismantled. Moose absolutely trashed this lake. There'd be no way you could get a permit to treat a lake the way moose treated this body of water. Lake Ojibwe was its name. It sort of became an open sewer. The shoreline was just totally degraded by moose. And I had absolutely no idea how this would all end. And the end was dramatic. I'll go through the unique history very briefly. A beaver dam that held back this Lake Ojibwe broke. The lake drained, and the wolves took advantage of the beavers high and dry and ate them all. This is one of the two wolves left on the island. He's got a stomach full of beaver. He's carrying a baby beaver in his mouth. They took the beaver out of that system completely. And then the lake itself was drained. It had held water for 70 years. The water's gone, became a mud flat, and the lake's gone. It's not coming back anytime soon, as far as I can tell. So this is a lake on a new direction. And again, it's sort of unpredictable what direction it's going to go, but water is not part of the future of this, what used to be a lake.
Okay, and so I'll kind of do what I can to conclude things here a little bit. We saw two basic themes. We saw this big overview of this time series we just have been thinking about, and then Rolf shared with us some of the kind of finer details of the same interactions. And so what does it all mean? I think one of the ways to answer the question is to appreciate how it is that humans sometimes tend to see nature, which is as a machine, and the role of a scientist is to figure out the rules of that machine. And we do that so that we can make humanity better. And that approach has a mixed track record. Just think of things like antibiotics. They're great for many, many aspects of human health, but when they're overused, they can be really very, very detrimental for the condition of livestock. Think about dams. They're quite valuable for the energy they can produce, but there have been some non-trivial side effects, negative side effects of dams. And again, a lot of this is all about, we figured out how nature works. We think we can manipulate it in a certain way for human betterment, and then we go from there. Dams I mentioned as an example of this. And I think that the whole program can just tend to make us a little overconfident about our ability to predict what the consequences will be for nature of any manipulations that we give it. And again, I would argue that a lot of it's just driven by the simple idea that nature is a little bit like a machine. It's got rules by which it operates, and we just got to figure out what those rules are. I think Isle Royale, if you think about the time series that I shared with you, how unpredictable many elements of it were, think about the dynamics that Rolf was describing to you a minute ago. Those things are all explainable after they occur, but there's no way in which they were predictable in advance. And so there's another way to think about how nature works. And of all things, Napoleon is a good way to kind of get our way into it. And that's that you wouldn't have predicted that Napoleon would take over much of Europe. He would eventually lose the battle at Waterloo, and then that would shape the history of European dynamics among humans for the next century. But after it occurred, you could explain it all. And so the idea here that I'm getting at is that maybe nature unfolds more like human history rather than, say, operating like a machine. Now, this idea is not totally foreign to ecologists and evolutionary biologists. It's understood, for example, that about 65 million years ago, an asteroid struck the planet. It was important for causing dinosaurs to have gone extinct and gave rise to mammals, which is the reason that we're all here today. And the arrival of that asteroid, of course, completely unpredictable, and who knows how life would have turned out if it didn't happen. So this notion of these historical contingencies, they've been around among the minds of ecologists and evolutionary biologists. But what's being proposed here now is a new riff on that idea, which is this isn't just something that occurs every 65 million years ago or just happens occasionally, but it's what describes nature on an unfolding basis, on a year-by-year basis. This notion that it unfolds like history does. You can explain it after it happens, but you're not going to be very good at predicting it. And this is to contrast with how other sciences sometimes work, like with neon. Perhaps every neon atom that has ever existed is exactly the same in its molecular weight and its crystal structure. That's probably just not the case for ecosystems. Ecosystems, whether they be lakes or rivers or islands, whatever the kind of ecosystem that we're talking about, they're each their own thing. And they unfold not unlike a human community history unfolds. And it probably might serve us to stop thinking about nature being like a machine quite so much, a little bit more like the way I'm describing now. And this may well be one of the most important lessons that Isle Royale can offer, because this insight that I'm talking about, you couldn't possibly have it except for unless you watched a place for a long, long time, try to explain it, and realize actually you're not very good at explaining until usually quite a bit after the dynamics have already occurred. And anyways, I think we can just leave it there. And I think it's our understanding that there's some opportunity for some questions and answers, and we'll leave that with our host. Oh yeah, go for it. So sorry. Oh, one more slide if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you both so much. I'm sure I speak for many people in the audience when I say that was a remarkable telling of a remarkable phenomenon in nature. And we are very thankful that you didn't stop watching back when the critics were maybe suggesting that you should stop. So I want to start with some kind of baseline questions that I'm seeing in the audience about just like confirming some of the factual pieces. And then there's a little bit of like, what does this mean for the larger conversation that I'd like to go into? So one of the first questions, or one of the prevalent questions was, how many wolves were introduced when they were reintroduced to the island?
19, total of 19.
Okay, great. And so related to that, just to get a little deeper into it, so I'm really intrigued and I don't know if you all have an answer to this, about the fact that it's obvious that the effects of inbreeding had occurred in a population that was around the same size as previous populations before it, but with a relatively recently introduced new aspect of the DNA with M93. So I'm really intrigued that there was such a crash in the inbreeding, from those wolves. And I wonder, getting to the question, was the fact that you all had figured out that M93 being introduced positively impacted the wolf system, was that a factor in your decision or the decision to reintroduce wolves? Or what was that conversation like to decide whether or not to reintroduce wolves yourselves?
Yeah, sure. No, there's a lot there, a lot of layers to peel through, but I think we can do it pretty handily. One of the things to appreciate is that while M93, when he arrived in 1997, that was the first time that we understood that a wolf would come to Isle Royale, become part of the population, and really be able to follow and track it all. And that was only possible because of modern techniques in genetics. What it did cause us to do is question what had been going on before 1997, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And because this is a little bit complicated. Theory would suggest that, my goodness, if this old gray guy could come in the 1990s, late 90s, kind of have his beneficial impact, but that beneficial impact is short-lived, and then the population goes right back into a very deeply inbred state. What was happening in all those prior decades? Shouldn't it have gone extinct at some point in time back then? One of the things we're able to do is just a couple of things. One is to inspect field notes that we just were able to interpret through a different light. And those field notes kind of indicated, yeah, there might have been other occasions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where a wolf likely came to the island and probably became part of the population, would have staved off inbreeding. And again, that interpreting those observations in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, just wouldn't have interpreted them that way, never would have had that ability to do so. But in hindsight, looks to be the case. Next thing to kind of appreciate is that, how do these wolves get to Isle Royale? They get to Isle Royale by crossing an ice bridge that forms in some winters, but not all winters. And the other thing that's really kind of key here is that in the 50s, 60s in particular, these ice bridges would have been forming like maybe 3 out of every 4 winters. So pretty often, most winters. And just because there's an ice bridge, it doesn't mean that a wolf is going to come and become part of the population. It just increases the chance that it can happen. And then what's happened since, say, the 60s and 70s right into the present day, now ice bridges are more in the neighborhood of maybe like twice in a decade or something like that. So much, much less. And that's been just enough to make it so that new wolves are just far less likely to become part of the population. So they're not going to fix their own inbreeding problems anymore. And so that became kind of a key part of the Park Service's decision. So the other thing that's kind of important about this is that whether to bring wolves back to Isle Royale was an important question about and for Isle Royale, but is also a surrogate question for the entire National Park Service, which is like, what do we do when climate change threatens a national park? Do you just say, that's the way it is, that's the new world that we live in? Or do we, when feasible, try to fight against it? And the Park Service, of course, in its 100+ year history, hasn't had to think about that too much until like recent years. And Isle Royale was kind of one of the kind of first really important businesses where I had to think through that.
You did a remarkable job of answering a poorly worded question. So thank you. Because I as I got more excited about what I was talking about, I kept adding another aspect to the question.
Yeah,
so but thank you very much. And for the audience, I hope that it's clear, or to rewatch the recording. But remarkable to think about how we revisit the history of what had happened before because of these new findings, and how that informs, the way that we approach management in the present. And I'm sure that same theme is salient for a lot of folks in the audience as we try to understand the effects of climate change and all the different work that we do. Another kind of base level question is, somebody had asked, were the beavers completely eliminated from the island during that time, or were, like, what was the actual impact to beavers during the breaking of the dam with the lake?
Oh, that one little case history, those beavers are gone. Yeah, a few of them survived. They moved upstream, but they didn't last long. So few square miles is devoid of beavers. And I don't think beavers can bring that lake back because there's nothing for them to feed on.
Hmm.
But in time, there's birch seedlings coming up in what is now dry land. In the decades or centuries, sure, beavers will probably find it again.
Hmm.
But
So,
beavers are greatly affected by the number of wolves present.
hmm hmm no, that's it. So they were only eliminated from that area. Is that correct? So there's other
That,
beaver populations on the island. Okay.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Got it. That was part of it. And then another question about predation patterns for wolves. So, do you know what percentage of their diet comes from moose versus beavers or other things? And does that vary by the season or by the year, or kind of how have you seen those dynamics play out?
Yeah, beaver are very important for wolves in the summertime. And they may constitute 50-75% of wolf food intake in the summertime. But beavers go to sleep in their lodges or go inside their lodges during the winter, and those lodges secure the beaver from wolves. So during the winter, roughly from November through April, moose are the only prey for wolves. So that's especially when it's a wolf moose system, pure and simple.
Hmm. Hmm. And thank you so much for that. And I'm getting an absolute flood of questions. So I apologize to folks that we will not be able to get to, but I do have a special couple questions that I'm seeing from students at Powell Township School. So I want to get at least one of those questions in here. So maybe as a review, what were the highest and lowest total number of moose that you observed on the island?
In the last 70 years or so, the highest number of moose was almost 2,500 just before the 1996 die-off, and the lowest was about 500 in the first decade of the 21st century.
Hmm.
So about
Great.
a five-fold change.
Yeah. Wow. And then kind of a fun question, but it sounds like there was some interest in the underwater video. So, how long can a moose hold its breath underwater? And can you talk more about kind of its the balance in the feeding patterns for the moose between like balsam furs and aquatic, and is it purely based on availability, or does that change in the season as well?
Oh yeah, moose are change their food habits tremendously from summer to winter. Summer is uh, aquatic plants as much as they possibly can and deciduous leaves. They don't touch coniferous vegetation until winter, and then it's the only thing they have left. But balsam fir is really a very challenging food for moose to eat, full of toxins. So they eat it because they have to, and there's nothing else for them to.
Hmm. Hmm. That makes a lot of sense.
How long can
Um,
we hold his
Oh,
breath?
how long can they hold their breath?
yeah.
Oh, a minute or more is no problem at all.
Uh-huh. Wow, that's incredible. Um, So there was a question that I think you answered, but it's worth asking again. So the parvovirus that impacted the wolves, there's evidence that that was introduced by humans on the island, or what is your understanding of that phenomenon?
Yeah, the history there, we should appreciate that canine parvovirus is a relatively new disease to the universe. It didn't exist anywhere in the 1970s and evolved from some cat diseases. And upon evolving from some cat diseases in the late 1970s, spread around the world probably in just a couple of months' time, primarily through domestic dogs. And then what we've been able to piece together, in some cases long after the fact, is that it seems as though somebody brought their dog to Isle Royale while they were infected but not dead, and that dog would have defecated somewhere on the island, and then an Isle Royale wolf would have sniffed it and picked up the canine parvovirus in a manner such as that. And that's how it got to Isle Royale. And so again, it's a great example of Isle Royale. Rolf mentioned this theme about isolation and about how Isle Royale is really isolated in some key ways and not isolated in some other key ways. This is a great example of, like, boy, you would think that a isolated island would be like immune from those kinds of human effects, but wow, it's such a subtle thing, a disease. And dogs are not allowed on Isle Royale, but it's sometimes people come to Isle Royale on their own boats, and then they can bring a dog, either maybe not knowing it's not a rule or just thinking they can get away with it.
Mm, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We also have a comment from Rachel saying, "Go Huskies! Thank you for a great presentation.
There you go.
Graduated MTU in 16, so that is great."
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah. So, I'm so sorry, everybody. I think this will be our last 1 to 2 questions. But another interesting one that I just saw was: do you have any evidence of wolves having left the island? I know we talked about the opportunities for wolves to enter the island, but intriguing to think about the opposite. So, do you have any evidence or thought that that may have happened in the past?
Oh, yes, for sure. Especially during the years when inbreeding was becoming more and more of an issue. Wolves actually bailed out from Isle Royale. I think we can think of 4 for sure, that some of them radio collared, who left the island looking for breeding opportunities because they do tend to outbreed if they can. So they were bailing themselves out of Isle Royale because of the inbreeding problem, which was quite obvious to them.
Great. And then final question, somewhat related to that is, and you may have spoken on this a little bit, but I think I saw it come up a few times. So were you able to find anything about M93 that particularly, was it just opportunistic, or was it, genes, DNA, something that made him more competitive, or was it behavioral, or do you have any insights into why that was so successful?
I think one of the things to appreciate is that what this is referred to as genetic rescue, where one individual wolf can come into a population and kind of rejuvenate its genetics. And again, this is another topic for which there's a great deal of theory that's been around for a bit of time, but the number of examples in the real world where you can look at a population, know it very, very well before the genetic rescue occurs, have the genetic rescue, and then see what happens afterwards, those opportunities are preciously rare. And so there's a lot that we don't know, but these are the most reasonable guesses or understandings of the dynamics. One thing is that all wolves have a different fitness. Some wolves are more fit than other wolves. And the wolf that decides to come to Isle Royale, that's a little bit of a random sort of thing. And whether that wolf was an amazing wolf by all wolf standards or just average is hard to know. But we do know he was amazing compared to Isle Royale wolves. For one thing, he was just physically larger. We could see that. He was extremely successful, had, I don't know, something like 34 offspring and grand offspring. And so within about 10 years of his arrival, 60% of the population's genes traced back to him. So genetically, he like took over the population. Relatively speaking, he was amazing compared to Isle Royale wolves. What we're a little less sure of is like, is that just because Isle Royale wolves were in such a very, very poor state? Or is that because that wolf was really, truly extraordinary? Probably was a little bit of both. And how much better he was than the native Isle Royale wolves is why his effect was so beneficial. It also, for more complicated reasons, is also why his effect wasn't so long lived. It only lasted for about 2.5 generations, 10 years, and then the inbreeding started to show up again. So, but lots of questions about how and why it happens. It may indeed because he brought with him genes that were, maybe particularly aggressive towards moose or just being larger. Could be that, and it could be just that he brought new genes, and so there was just a little bit less inbreeding.
Yeah, incredible. Well, thank you both so much. And I am going to get into our outro, but one final note from Danny McGeary saying, "Go Huskies. I took Rolf's mammalogy class at Tech back in 06, and I keep tabs on the research. So many thanks for the presentation. Tons of appreciation in the chat for you both. I will just now quickly take all of our attendees through our final outro slides here. So we encourage you to become a regular with these monthly webcasts. So the second Wednesday of every month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, I'd like to tell you about a few that we have coming up here. So we have Plants and People, examining how indigenous knowledge systems help conserve native plant communities with Tanisha Williams of University of Georgia Herbarium. And that is happening in February of this year. And we have Towards Sustainability, Developing a Comprehensive Climate Action Plan with Katie Carlisle and Jennifer Jaworski with Huron-Clinton Metro Parks. That is in March of 2025. And we have 21st Century Stewardship, Infusing Environmental Stewardship with Global Citizenship Education with Ava Goodale with Deerfield Academy. And that is in April of 2025. So finally, thank you all so much for attending today. Thank you to Rolf and John. That was absolutely incredible. And we hope that you all will join us next month. Take care.
Bye now.